because I think there was a rogue online, somebody got a link and just submitted. Didn't look filled out by anybody here, so I've excluded that from the data. But thanks a lot for participating. That was a lot of fun. And when we have SeaHAC in 2 years, we'll do it for real. And then we're just going to save the club a bunch of money so we don't have to hire a GM. Right? So there was kind of some big news and unprecedented is that we actually got 2 people in the same room to agree on the team name. So Seattle Grunge is now the team name because we got 2 people to submit, or 2 groups to submit the same. That's never happened in Seattle, so I'm psyched. Let's put that to bed. We're done. Take it to the bank. There was not a requirement that you had to be under the cap. This is a 30-man roster right now, and a lot of teams are going to have to do some trades, especially if they want to sign any of the free agents that we asked them about. So very cool. You can also see some interesting names. Shirley's Revenge. Seattle Melnick-outs. Nice. Tree Huggers. Very good. And then this will be posted online. I'll shoot the link to everybody, but you can kind of drill in and see how will show up better when I test it on my machine. But you can kind of see where each team is and what their team looks like. So that'll be updated. All right. One sec. I gotta resubmit something. There's a lot more to it.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I think everyone picked it. Kyle, Capobianco.
So this is no surprise, the people that spent the most actually have the oldest team as well. You figure that happens, but sorry. Nothing major on the age that I saw.
What was the most expensive meal we won, right?
Weapon ass.
And then this is the most popular by team.
Ooh.
So and again, I'll post a link. I'm going to send one last email to everybody, thanking them, maybe some feedback, but also with the links to everything. But I won't ever use that email again, unless you're local. I might say, "Hey, let's do this every quarter." So anyway, you can kind of take a look. Anybody want to see a specific team? you can call it out. San Jose. Dom's boy.
Yeah.
Oh, Alex True, local boy. Well, kind of. But
Who was the most unanimous pick?
I have that.
Looks like JT Miller.
Yeah, it was Johnson.
Yeah.
I'll get there. LA. Cal Peterson. Jeff Carter's on there, top grade. Yeah.
Good locker room guy.
There's some interesting ones. So Ryan Murray, another Everett guy for every folks.
That one's in.
And then this is our roster right here.
Hey.
So we're gonna send it to the league.
It's hard, yeah.
You can go ahead and tweet that out. I'm sure it'll make breaking news. We have 2 citizens on the team. That's kind of cool. Except that, as far as I know, they're not related. They're definitely not brothers. Yeah.
Jesus, yeah.
Any thoughts?
Yeah.
You never know with goalies, right? That's what we learned today.
Go down. Let's press the forwards.
Ethan Bear, yeah, that was Ethan Bear. Yeah, another local boy, right? Yeah. I don't know, maybe the fact that he's gonna be like 36. Not that goalie's age or anything. Yeah, he's never that. Chris Tierney, I thought that was a little bit of a stretch, but, okay.
Exactly.
And then, here's our UFAs, who signed? It's crowdsourced, you get what you pay for.
You did.
And then any guests who are, what do we call it, Emily, our super
Our
duper?
special acquisition. Tamarind.
Yeah, Carlson. Oh, whoa. Anyway, I'll post this online to the site. Thanks for participating. And I know somebody submitted after the deadline of 5 o'clock this morning, which you didn't know about, but that was when I pulled all the data. So I will incorporate that new submission. We're probably going to do a kind of a more broader crowdsourcing of this. I think it was a fun exercise, and it's good to compare this with this room compared to out in the wild, particularly in Seattle, that people haven't been paying attention to hockey as long. So it should be interesting. Couple announcements. People that need to maybe interested in sharing a ride to the airport. After, just go over here and raise your hand. There's also light rails, walkable distance. If you need insights on where to get to light rail, I can point in the right direction. But and then the Angry Beaver event as well. Like if people need a ride, I have space for 2 more. If people need a ride, I can get them up there, not necessarily get them back. So that's about it. Any questions on the expansion exercise? I think it would be fun in 2 years when this starts to really solidify as far as who's actually going to be protected. So it's going to be interesting. It was a fun exercise for me because it hasn't been we haven't really talked rosters yet. We're all winners. We're Seattle on. That's what I was saying. Actually, NHL Seattle won because they don't have to pay for a GM now. Right?
Don't talk to them directly.
Okay.
I've got a question. Did a previous analytics conference do the same thing for Vegas? And if so,
No.
No? Okay.
No. Well, not that I know of, because I was only at VanHack last year. Anybody at VanHack 2 years ago go through that?
We didn't do that.
I can't imagine they did.
I think Ottawa did it a couple years ago.
Ottawa did it. So anyway, thanks for participating. Pretty cool. We had, I think, 28 submissions, which is probably more than I expected. So anyway, good work. I'll tell you what the league says.
work, everybody.
Man, nothing gets your day going like pulling some data at 5 a.m., am I right? Yeah, John loves pulling data. Okay, we are going to get back to our presenters now. Our next presenter, he's an undergraduate student actually at Stanford University. He is studying computer science there. He writes for Blue Shirt Banter and Dauber Hockey, and he also likes to collect his own special teams data. He is going to do his talk on analyzing power play strategy. So from Palo Alto, California, here is Scott Marin.
Those of you who are doing lightning talks, I sent out a link to a Google folder. It's easiest if you drop your slides in there, as we currently have a whole bunch of issues with the HDMI cable. So if you have slides, which you don't need to have, drop them in there and we'll pop them up when your talk comes.
I'm not sure what happened.
Oh, hold on.
All right, sorry for the technical difficulties, but my presentation is Power Play Strategy, how teams can enter the zone. So to start, why focus on power plays? As Mike and Ryan touched on yesterday, power plays are a very important part of the game, but they often get overlooked in basic traditional analysis. There's some reason for this, as most of the game occurs at even strength, but we can still extract a lot of useful information from power plays. However, if we're going to be studying power plays, we should tailor our analysis to suit the specific needs of what goes on during special teams play, because it's a much different game state than even strength play. With an extra skater and lack of need for defense, power plays are much more structured around generating offense than regular 5v5 play. And this is how we end up with diagrams like this, where we have example of the center lane option, and teams have these specific breakout formations that they use to get into the offensive zone. So because of these differences, we shouldn't be analyzing even strength play and special teams in the exact same manner. There's been plenty of work on this already, highlighted by just 2 talks from yesterday about special teams data, but we've come a long way in even just the past few years with recent advancements with special teams. We already know that it's better to enter the zone with control. It's better to enter the zone with a strong structure in the offensive zone. It's better to have a strong structure in the offensive zone. And it's better to play down low, closer to the net, than playing farther back at the blue line. However, there's still a lot that we do want to know. How are individual players moving on the ice? How are teams collectively moving together through the different zones? And does this even matter? So through the data I've collected, it looks like it does. It looks like different entry formations are better suited for different tasks. And using this, we can both change the way that we play to take advantage of these different pros and cons. And hopefully in the future, use this additional context to better model and predict power play performance. So I'm sure you're asking, where's the evidence? Otherwise, you probably wouldn't be at this presentation. So over the last 2 years and across around 4,000 zone entries, I've been collecting my own data on how teams enter the zone and what they do, what's in there. So this mostly comprised of traditional statistics that have been commonly used, like success percentage, how often teams enter the blue line with control, or how often they do enter, and then control percentage, how often they enter with control, shots, shot attempts. A few non-conventional metrics such as in formation, time to get into formation, the handedness of players in the offensive zone, and then primarily grouping entry types based on player positioning, such as the connect center lane and other breakout formations used. Overall, it's a lot of data, and there's a lot of interesting things that I wish I could talk about, but in the interest of actually fitting in my 20-minute time slot, I'll be going over the different entry types and seeing what sorts of interesting patterns emerge, if any. So what do we see when looking at different entry types? Comparing the two, we generally see a greater difference in control percentage than success percentage. We see that formations that utilize the center of the ice tend to perform better than the zone entry types that stick to the outside of the ring. And we see that there's also an importance of structure outside of the offensive zone that can be just as important as generating structure within the offensive zone. So with that out of the way, we can start talking about the specific entries, and starting at the top, which one's the best? Well, there's not really the best entry. A lot of that depends on context, and it would be a bit misleading to say there's one overall best encompassing entry. It can vary based on team, neutral zone forechecking scheme, and everything. But there is one zone entry that across the board performed very well and overall has a lot of advantages, despite its reputation among fans as one of the worst power play entries, and that's the neutral zone drop pass. Yes, this entry is the best. But besides times when it doesn't work like that with Go Rangers, you also get really nice entries like this. Yes, the Leafs have a lot of really good drop passes, where you see generally they get in the zone very well. So what can we take away from the drop pass? Overall, there's not really an area that the drop pass doesn't do bad in. It has strong shot metrics, a good inform percentage, and overall looks like, in general, one of the best entry types that a team can employ. Most importantly, the drop pass has the highest control percentage out of all entries, and has an almost equally strong success percentage. We can see this show up in the extra time and space generated after drop pass is completed and the player receiving the puck gets it. We can see this in the example above with the Pittsburgh Penguins, where Chris Letang is giving a drop pass to Phil Kessel. So once Phil Kessel receives the puck and he gets to the defensive blue line, we see that he has a number of different options where he could go with the puck. He could go to his left, where he has a winger on the opposite side of the ice. He can pass the puck up to his right, where another Pittsburgh Penguins forward is at the offensive blue line. He can continue skating in that direction, and we also see Chris Letang moving towards the center of the ice, where he can create a soft option for the Kessel. Now, with all these options, you have Patrice Bergeron in the middle of the neutral zone. There's kind of not much he could do here, where if he overcommits to one option, Kessel can just go the other way. So effectively, he's stuck in the neutral zone. And there's not much he can do to actively defend against this. He can just try to contain and mitigate the damage. So as we go further through the entry, we see Phil Kessel takes the puck up the ice down the right side and effectively creates a mini 2-on-1 situation for Zdeno Chara. Patrice Bergeron is trying to come back to the right side of the neutral zone, but Phil Kessel and Patrick Hornquist are already approaching the blue line against Zdeno Chara, outnumbering him. So what's Chara doing in this situation? There's not much he can do, where if he pressures Phil Kessel, he can give the puck to Patrick Hornquist, and then Patrick Hornquist kind of has an easy entry into the zone. And, well, he's not going to just pressure Patrick Hornquist, then Phil Kessel gets easy breakaway. So Zdeno Chara is kind of forced to just contain and back off, allowing Phil Kessel and Patrick Hornquist to enter the zone with control. And you see this a lot throughout drop passes, where generating these sorts of options give the attacking team a better chance at entering the zone with control. So then I also tracked different drop pass variations, and within the drop pass, you see that different variations are also well suited for different situations. While control percentage mostly stayed the same, depending on the different entry types, you had different drop passes that performed in different situations better. So with the drop pass without the actual drop, which is where a team lines up in the drop pass formation but doesn't actually drop the pass back, that had a very high success percentage going into the zone. However, once in the zone, it starts to struggle with lower shot metrics and lower inform percentage. And then contrast that with the double drop pass, which was a drop pass variation where you have a team make a drop pass and then immediately make another drop pass. That struggled successfully entered the zone quite as often as the other drop pass variations. But what you saw was, once getting in the zone, that overall it had a much higher inform percentage and had better shot metrics than the other drop pass entries. And then comparing the more general drop pass variations, the drop pass and the drop pass from the side, similar to what Ryan found in his presentation yesterday, we saw that drop passes from the center of the ice generally outperform drop passes from the side. So it had a higher success percentage and overall better shot metrics than drop passes that were completed from the side. This is interesting to look at, especially when looking at other zone entry formations. And we begin seeing the pattern emerge that entry types utilizing the center of the ice tend to perform very well. We can see this when comparing the drop pass to an entry like the 5-back, which overall there's a lot of red on that graph. It did not do very well. So it had the second lowest success percentage in the sample of zone entries, and it had the lowest control percentage, the lowest average shot attempts, scoring chances, shots on goals, and goals per entry, and overall was not a very effective entry formation. We can see this in example with the Los Angeles Kings, where they're trying to employ the 5-back entry. A lot of times it's too predictable and doesn't provide a lot of options for the player breaking out with the ball. So we begin the entry with Drew Doughty coming to the defensive blue line, and we can see the 4 other Los Angeles Kings forwards lining up in the 5-back formation and then preparing for a pass. Now, ideally, what you would have is both sides equally as an option. So Doughty can either go to the right or the left side. But what you actually see in practice a lot of times is that really the only true option here is Kempe getting past player 3, where player 1 is effectively taken out of the play. There's not much doubt he can do to get up to the puck. I guess he can pass through the second Kings player, and the second Kings player and the first Kings player, they're both effectively guarded by the neutral zone forechecker, the Sharks player. So we can also tell by body position and the third Kings player how he's preparing to receive the pass that Doughty's likely to go to the left side of the neutral zone. And this is made sort of very clear even before he makes the pass. So the Sharks can even begin defending this type of entry before it happens. And that's exactly what we see as the entry progresses. As the Kings player, he gets the puck, and as they try to enter the offensive zone, what happens is San Jose, their penalty killing structure really isn't breaking up, and they're prepared for the entry. I have it as there's 2.5 San Jose defenders, because the third Sharks forechecker is able to even start coming and take away some of the area in the middle of the ice. But effectively, what you have when the Kings are trying to get into the zone here is 2-on-2. And on the power play, where you have an extra man, you want to create odd man situations where you could take advantage of the fact that you have an extra man and create these situations where you could enter the zone and utilize that extra man. So putting yourself in a situation where you're at a 2v2, what happens is a lot of times with the 5 back, it's just generally tough to enter when you're going against 2 defenders like that. So also, this isn't a conventional entry structure. It's more something I noticed while I was tracking data in the beginning. And up until now, I've talked about the 5-back drop pass entries conventionally classified under hockey plays and strategies. And as you can probably tell from the name, the 3-back entry, yes, I'm not very creative. There are 3 players that come from behind the net in the defensive zone. And then the remaining 2 offensive players, they start near the offensive blue line, where they're posted up far away from the play. And what's interesting about this entry is that even the 2 forwards, they're stationary at the blue line. And overall, it's not a bad entry. It has it performs about league average, but it outperforms other entries like the Dallas cut and the 5-back. And overall, it has its benefits and drawbacks. Particularly where it doesn't perform well is once entering the zone, where we see a noticeable decline in in-form percentage with entries used using 3-back formation. So to highlight this, we can take a look at 2 particular examples. The one with the Pittsburgh Penguins, and then this one with the New York Rangers. So what happened? With the New York Rangers entry, overall it did successfully enter the blue line, but once they got in, they couldn't really do much with it. Where with the Pittsburgh Penguins entry, they got in the blue line and there was plenty of space, and they're slightly cut off towards the end, but they do get into formation. So what happens is, in the Pittsburgh entry, you see the puck carrier come more towards the middle of the ice, drawing the opposition to the one side, and then moving the puck back to the right side, creating a lot of space for them to enter the zone, and then using that to get in formation. Where with the Rangers entry, what happens is they give the puck to the side of the ice much more quickly. And as they try to progress through the neutral zone, the opposition knows that the Rangers are targeting that side of the rink and are prepared for it. So once they finally do enter the zone, there's not much room to work with, and they struggle getting into formation. So we can see here that once the Rangers actually do break the blue line and get in, the 2 labeled Rangers players there were the 2 forwards in the 3-back that started at the offensive blue line. So once Zibanejad enters the blue line, he doesn't have that much support. Zuccarello actually does a pretty good job of attempting to support Zibanejad, but look at Brett Howden, where that's where he started in the entry, and once they do enter the zone at the end, he's pretty much in the same place. So when employing the 3-back entry, while those players can be useful to stretching out the defense at the beginning of the entry, once you get in the zone, they're not nearly as effective because it's hard for them to get in a position of support. So up until this point, those have been all structured entries. And another interesting thing about my study was, or I think that I also looked at unstructured entries, which I call random entries, where teams weren't lined up in structure. They attempted to enter the offensive zone without a noticeable entry structure. So it's a bit, not so much mixed results, but once you get into the zone, there's not so much of a noticeable difference with random entries as opposed to more structured entries, where the shot metrics are pretty much league average, and even control percentage is mostly the same as other entry types. But where you do see a noticeable decline with random entries is in success percentage, where teams that don't try to enter the offensive zone with well-defined structure struggle with entering the zone. And it's not hard to imagine why this would be so, as it's hard to do anything when everybody isn't on the same page, but it's promising to see the data confirm this, as a lot of times, as I'm sorry for the Kings fans out there, that all my bad examples are coming from them, but there were a lot of bad examples to choose from the Kings power play this year. Why isn't this? Oh, here we go. So here's a particular random entry that sticks out in my mind as I'm glad the sense of like confusion and chaos like was conveyed, because for somebody who like doesn't look at power plays all the time, that might have just been like, all right, that's a regular entry. But while I was tracking this, I was screaming at my laptop at Kovalchuk, like, what are you doing? This is not how power plays work. So basically, what happens is we can see here, Alec Martinez is he's just trying to collect the puck, and Kovalchuk comes in and steals it from his own teammate. And I don't know what Jeff Carter's thinking over on the side, but I'm sure he doesn't know what's going to happen next. And overall, there's just a lot of unnecessary chaos and unpredictability that happens from Kovalchuk trying to be a hot shot and take it in through the zone while he can. So generally, on power plays, you don't want to be put in this position where Kovalchuk's facing the wrong side of the ice against the forechecker coming after him with no support because his teammates didn't know that he was planning on doing this. And overall, we see the pass fail, the entry fail. And it sums up quite nicely why unstructured entries might have such a low success percentage. And then, so we have another kind of category of unstructured entries. Besides random entries, you have neutral zone regroups, where the puck immediately leaves the offensive zone and teams try to enter again. At the Vancouver Hockey Analytics Conference in 2018 last year, SFU concluded that neutral zone regroups had a higher expected value per minute than full regroups at the AHL level. I found similar results, even though I specifically didn't track the time it took to complete an entry. I found that regroups had mostly in line with a lot of the other entries, similar statistics like shot metrics, success percentage, control percentage, and there's been a lot of past research showing that neutral zone regroups occur much quicker and take much less time to execute. In a control environment where you want to maximize the 2 minutes of power play time you have, it makes sense that entry types that generate the same kind of results but in much less time would have much more value. And that was supposed to play, but here's just a regular regroup where we have the Sharks quickly get back into the zone. So overall, after here's just a table of all the different entry types with the informed percentage that came from them, and I just took a quick look at some of the correlations. I found R squared value of 0.07 with shot attempts and goals, which is similar to what Eric Harness found in his special teams project, and I was interested in seeing what the R squared values would be for informed percentage, time in zone, and time in form was with goals. And overall, I didn't find anything super interesting, but I kind of wasn't expecting to. I thought time into form might be a little more promising, but overall, nothing super insightful. I thought it was interesting that inform percentage had a R-squared value of 0.278 with shot attempts, but I think the way to go for future power play analysis is something similar to what Eric did with his Zephyr stat, and combining different aspects of power play and building a model that can do a better job of modeling power plays besides looking for one single measurable statistics that can do a good job of correlating power plays with what we goals. So, is there anything that we can learn from looking at all these zone entries? There, like I alluded to in the beginning, there was just looking at the different zone entry types, there was a larger gap between control percentage and success percentage, where between the highest entry, between the entry with the highest success percentage and the lowest success percentage, it was only a difference of 8%. The difference between the zone entry with the largest control percentage and the smallest control percentage had a difference of 24%, which might just be due to the drop passes overwhelming success with controlled entry percentage. And then we also see a recurring theme of zone entry types utilizing the middle of the ice, outperforming the zone entries that generally stick to the outside of the ring, where we see some of the top zone entries like the single swing that connects in a lane and the drop pass with the highest success percentages, all characterized by use of the middle of the ice, where we see the entries kind of trailing like the Dallas Cup and the 5-back, primarily entries that run through the sides of the ring. And also the idea that structure plays an important role outside the offensive zone, where a lot of work has been done quantifying the impact of structure in the offensive zone. It's also important to maintain structure outside the offensive zone that can be beneficial to the teams entering the zone. And finally, the different entry types have their different pros and cons based on their structure. We saw with the 3-back where while it does a good job of getting to the zone, it's harder to get to form, and this is similar across a lot of different zone entries. So I think there are a lot of applications to looking at power plays in a manner like this. League-wide, we can look at overall trends and try to attempt to see if some power play entry attempts are inherently more advantageous than others, and if there might be better matchups between different zone entries and neutral zone forechecking schemes that we can take advantage of. At the team level, we can look at, do certain teams excel at different entries? What are they doing right? What are they doing wrong? As kind of a good case study, sorry Los Angeles Kings fans again, but you saw when they really struggled with their power play at the beginning of the year. A key reason for this was just their insistent use on a very horrendous 5-back formation, where their two most common entry attempts, the drop pass and the 5-back, where their drop pass entries were overall pretty successful and in line with the league average. They really struggled with the 5-back, and maybe noticing this a bit earlier and shifting what they used on the power play could have mitigated some of the damage. Maybe not mitigated the damage that fully went on, but just the power play. And then at an individual level, our specific types of players better suited for different formations. So overall, a few limitations of what I did. Obviously, sample size is always an issue, and it'd be nice to get a wider dispersal of teams where there's a slightly higher proportion of Eastern teams represented in my sample as I lived on the East Coast, and just regular bias and error in tracking. And all this data was not adjusted for the neutral zone forechecking schemes used. So in the future, that's definitely something that would be interesting to look at. And I have some neutral zone forechecking data that I hope to analyze power play entry types against. And hopefully in the future, we can see how individual players and different player types affect zone entries along with neutral zone formations, and use this along with opponents' formations and league averages to generate expectations for these sorts of entries. And I'm very excited with Brian's work, as one of the things we're hoping to see in the future is quantifying and adding spatial player movement. And I think that could be really important to quantify the differences in like the drop pass and three backs, seeing how much space really is available after a drop pass or after key movements. This work wouldn't be possible without the work done by Ryan Walter in his book Hockey Plays and Strategies, and all the other hockey analysts who've done really amazing work. Special thanks to CJ and Ryan for helping out with the data visualizations, and yeah, thanks for listening.
All right, thank you guys very much for that. You guys are stuck with me for one, maybe two presentations while Darren does something else. We've got Daniel Kosinski up next. Daniel is a longtime Detroit Red Wings fan and is part of the U.S. Army Tank Automotive Research Development and Engineering Center. He's a data analysis enthusiast and is interested in finding ideal ways to use publicly available data to, present hockey data or publicly available hockey data.
Thank you, guys. First of all, before I get started, I just want to say a thank you to all the organizers for this conference. They've done a great job the last couple of days. And then also a thank you to all the presenters we've had so far and the ones we still have to come, because you guys have all done a great job. I've really loved seeing all the work and the different perspectives on everything that everyone's had. It's really great to come out here and see all that. Okay, so from some of the other presentations we've seen throughout the couple of days, seen a lot of people who put in so much effort collecting a lot of manual data to incorporate into their analyses. And then I was really glad to see all the amazing data that we had presented from some of the Sports Logic different presenters. That data you guys have is amazing. I'm pretty jealous about that data. But what I'm going to talk to you guys about is my work utilizing some of the data that's available to each and every one of us through the NHL's website, some of their data sources, and how those can be integrated together to basically work to evaluate some situational team and player performance. So for my talk, I'm going to go a little bit over some of my motivation for this work, kind of some of the questions I wanted to answer and what my goals were. I'll talk a little bit about the data sources that I used for this project and how I integrated that data together to kind of make the data sources themselves provide more information than the sum of the parts. I'll go over some of the context provided by the integration, providing some of the context that we've seen in a lot of different places in terms of metrics of interest like Corsi rates and percentages and goal rates and percentages. At different strengths for different teams, home and away, all that sort of information. And then also some examples of additional context that I've been able to develop utilizing that data that I haven't seen really in other places, that I think gives a lot more situational insight into how players and teams perform in different situations. And then talk a little bit about the new data, new challenges. Basically with the new data the NHL is going to be collecting starting next year for player and puck tracking. Just some ideas for kind of utilizing that if it eventually becomes available to kind of integrate with the current data set and augment analysis going forward. So a little bit about my motivation. It's mainly two main parts. Getting started on, being a hockey fan and loving data, I kind of first wanted to know exactly what data is collected for all the games and where it's at. So there's a lot of data that's out there. I know a lot of you guys are probably familiar with many of these data sources, but some of you might not be. So first of all, I went in and kind of looked at all the different data that I could find and see what I thought would be useful, and basically how that data could be integrated together. And then kind of leading into the second part of the motivation with some of the limitations I saw on a lot of the context for some of the available stats of interest that we look at in terms of Corsi numbers, goal percentages, and rates. So, and how I could utilize that data to provide not only the current, similar to the current context in terms of team strength, game score, teammates and opponents on the ice at the same time, and some zone start information, but how I can more effectively integrate that and split up the game into different sequences based off of fully integrating the zone start data and face-off result information, and some kind of generalizing some of the teammate and opponent strengths to kind of combine the data together to provide greater insight. So basically, the data sources that I worked with, the NHL API, which for those of you who don't know, has all the team roster and player information on head coaches, the referees, and linesmen throughout the game, which is fun data because then you can see which refs like to call hooking penalties versus tripping, some interesting things like that. Venue information, what arena each game was at, all the plays, face-off, shots, hits, giveaways, and then location information for those in terms of XY coordinates, game time and score of the game for each play, and then also the players directly involved in each of the plays. I say directly involved because for hits, it'll have the hitting player and the player that's hit. For goals, it'll have the scoring player, whoever got assists, and the goalie for that particular goal. And then I also integrated in the NHL full play-by-play data, which similarly to the API data, had all the play information in terms of what zone each play occurred in, neutral zone, offensive zone, defensive zone, what the game time and players involved in directly in the play, and also all the players who are on the ice for each of those individual plays, and the team strength for each play in terms of even strength of power play. And then also the NHL roster reports, which had the team roster and player information, head coaches, refs, and linesmen, and the venue information. So similar to the API data, but it was kind of necessary to link up the API and full play-by-play data, and then also to link up with the last data source, the actual shift reports for both teams involved in each game, you know, when each player's shift begins and ends. So these are all the data sources that I integrated together. And in my backup slides, which all the slides will be made available at the end of the conference for anyone, I have kind of links for all these different data sources. I know a lot of you guys are familiar with these, but for those of you who aren't, you can kind of go in there to see what sort of publicly available data there is and play around with that if you want. So then after looking at the data that I wanted to integrate together, I had to figure out how to integrate it. And the focus for my integration of this data was to kind of create a highly flexible database that could answer many different questions. But for this presentation, I'm kind of just going to focus on the integration work that I did to add the necessary context to evaluate the situational team and player performance. So basically the basis of this work was splitting the game into a set of what I refer to as constant context paired sequences that basically they will have the same players on the ice throughout each of these sequences, which is gathered from the shift data, which says who's out on the ice during at any one time. And then specifying that each of these sequences begins with a face-off or a player coming on the ice in the midst of play, shifting on for another player from the shift data and using the API and full play-by-play data for the face-off information. And then the context is built up for each of these sequences based off of the shift data, which gives you how many players on the ice for any second within the game, and the API full play-by-play data, which gives you the score at that point in the game, and a lot of the other information related to the face-offs, which team won the face-off that started that context. So the reason I say constant context paired sequences is because, you know, the constant context, all the same players on the ice for each of these individual sequences, and paired because you've got two teams out on the ice, you know, 5-on-4 for one team is a 4-on-5 for the other. And then once these sequences are built, I built in the traceability for all the plays and players to each sequence that is defined, so that you can basically summarize all of these different sequences based off of the starting conditions that you're interested in, to see how the league-wide averages for these metrics based off of the context that's available, and then how each team does in these situations and individual players as well. So basically, the context that this overall integration ends up providing is kind of some of your traditional context, the team strength, game score and score differential, location, game time, and then teammates that are on the ice, and opponents as well. But it also provides the additional situational context for each of these sequences, how they start out with offensive zone face-off, defensive or neutral zone face-off, or whether it's what I refer to as on-the-fly shift with the player just coming off from the bench. And if the sequence is a face-off, basically incorporates in the result of the face-off, whether the team won or lost. And then what I incorporated in as well, basically generalized teammate and opponent strengths based off of kind of the proxy of 5-on-5 ice time per game to see, which players got the most ice time were basically treated as first liners, and which ones got the forwards got the least amount of ice time were treated as fourth liners, and same with first through third pair defensemen. So obviously I probably should have made a little bit better graphics for a lot of this. I've got some eye charts with some of the results of this, but this is kind of the first view of the situational data, kind of the data we've already seen. In this case, referring to strength information, which you can see basically summarizes all the different strengths throughout this season up through a couple weeks ago that occurred with greater than 1,000 seconds of game time, where you have information on attempts, for and against, Corsi offensive and defensive rates, goals for both teams, goal offensive and defensive rates as well. Basically, kind of for all these different strengths, 5-on-5 obviously is the most common of these, and you can see from that basically more time at 5-on-5 than any of the others combined. So what I go into next is kind of looking at drilling down into that 5-on-5 time for based on how the individual sequences start with, whether it's defensive zone, neutral zone, or offensive zone face-off, or on-the-fly sequences. So from this, you can see a face-off in the defensive zone. Players out on the ice for that are actually at a disadvantage where their Corsi rates expected to be around 29%. So players starts all his shifts in the defensive zone. Obviously, no one does that, but if they did, they wouldn't be expected to have a Corsi number around 50%. They'd be expected around 29%. So it basically allows you to split out some of this information based off of what sort of situations individual players and teams are put in. And with the one at the bottom, you can see built on this further by looking at the actual results of those face-offs and incorporating that in there as well. So when the offensive zone face-off is 1, you can see that basically per 60 minutes of play, the teams average about 2.5 goals scored per 60 minutes more than their opponents. So you can see kind of, obviously that's the most advantageous situation for a team. So you can look at which teams take the most advantage of those opportunistic situations. And basically what I have on this eye chart is basically all the teams throughout for 5-on-5 play throughout the season, and you can see the Toronto Maple Leafs have the best performance in terms of the metric I define, the goals differential rate per 60 minutes of about 0.77 goals per 60 minutes of play that they outscore their opponents at in terms of 5-on-5 play. So we can then basically look at this and drill down into what situations the Maple Leafs do the best at, and basically how they capitalize, how they get to such good numbers by what situations they do best at. So here kind of you have the paired up league-wide stats for this that you can look at compared to the Toronto Maple Leafs stats, and see that for offensive zone situations, specifically down when they win the actual offensive zone faceoffs, that they outperform the league averages by over double, scoring at a rate, outscoring their opponents at double the league-wide average rate. So basically, when they get these opportunistic situations of offensive zone face-offs, they take advantage of those a lot more than other teams do in the league. And stuff like this is valuable because a lot of what the NHL is about is that guy used to be the wings coach, and he would always talk about R&D, Rob and do, finding which teams are best at doing certain things, figuring out, then drilling down into what's all the details of that to figure out what they do to be so great at that. So this sort of stuff can help identify which teams are best in which situations and should be then drilled down into by looking at video to see what they do to be so successful at those sort of situations. And similarly, you can basically drill down further into this data to see which players on a team most significantly help their team in different situations. So basically from this, you can see for all the defensemen for Toronto in these different sorts of sequences that start in the different zones and on-the-fly sequences that Morgan Riley performs the best out of all the defensemen for what I refer to as kind of set play sequences that begin with actual face-offs in the different zones. But he's not the top player for on-the-fly sequences. Jake Muzzin, Jake Gardner, obviously Jake Muzzin here has significantly less ice time than either of Gardner or Morgan Riley, who's third in that list, but Jake Gardner performs better than Riley for the on-the-fly sequences. So you can see from this, if he's rested when a shift begins with a face-off, Morgan Riley would be the ideal defenseman to keep out for the face-off. But for on-the-fly sequences, you want to get Jake Gardner out on the ice as much as possible. And similarly, you can look at the data for the forwards for Toronto to see who performs the best in any of the different situations. So this is the defensive zone face-offs and neutral zone face-offs for all the forwards on Toronto. And similarly for offensive zone and on-the-fly sequences as well. Once again, I apologize for the readability of these slides, but they'll be all made available so you guys can take a look on your own time to just get an idea for this data. And then kind of the other situation, so that's all dealing with 5-on-5 play in the different zones that occurs, but that's not all the context that's incorporated in. There's all the opponents that the individual players go up against, and by tracing all the players to these individual sequences, you can see what opponents each player goes up against and how they perform on a player-by-player matchup level against any of these different opponents. But with opponents you play against so many different people, then it's good to kind of standardize your definition of these players. Treat some as first-line players, third-line defensemen, that sort of thing. And you can kind of do a proxy of this based off of each player's 5-on-5 ice time per game. And that's what you kind of get into here, where you can look at Morgan Riley's performance against all the different strengths of forward from first to fourth line. And you see basically, if you look at the delta goal rate metric that I'm talking about, he does pretty well across the board against all levels of competition at forward. And kind of the same thing if you look at defensive pairings that he goes up against in terms of their strengths. He kind of has positive metrics for the delta goal rate across the board for that as well. And similarly, you can look at all the teammates that he plays with. Obviously, Ron Tamesy, his defensive partner for the vast majority of his ice time out at 5-on-5. You can see their stats for basically the team outscoring the other team significantly in those situations. You can see which teammates he does the best at. And you can normalize this data as well on a per game basis as to who's on the first, second, and third line to basically see when, in this case, when Morgan Riley's paired up with the top couple of top line or so of players, the Maple Leafs basically outscore their opponents at over a 2-to-1 clip at 5-on-5 hockey, which is obviously very good. But across the board, he does pretty well even with lower line forwards as well. And finally, you can do the same sort of thing with the defensemen, kind of for teammates as well, to see when he's out there. Obviously, he's mostly out there on the first line with fellow line mate Ron Hainsey, but he's been out there with other players at other levels of who get to see other levels of ice time as well, and kind of see how he performs with those types of teammates as well. And basically, the next thing is, the final thing is just about the new data, new challenges. So obviously with player and puck tracking data, there's a whole new realm of opportunities if this gets integrated with the existing data sources. From automating a lot of the data that you've seen some people collect manually, from automating collection of like shot assist data to characterizing transition opportunities. Obviously, the sports logic data set you've seen, they can already kind of do that to a degree with their information, but that's also going to be possible with player and puck tracking data as well. And then kind of automate collection of the zone entry and exit stats, characterization of strength of hits, not something you really think about, but with the player tracking, you can see the sort of accelerations for different players when they hit their opponents, who puts out the hardest hits, and correlate some of that with potential injury rates for players, see which players to avoid for forwards when going into danger areas. And then kind of more consistently identify change of possession over the current giveaway takeaway stats, which we all know are pretty flawed and subject to arena biases. And then also adding additional context to a lot of these sequences. Basically what I tried to do is get as much context as possible from the data that's there, but there's some context that can't be developed in terms of actual defensive formations or breakout setups that you could get from the player and puck tracking data. And then try to also better characterize the player types. You know, is a player a puck carrier and setup artist, or are they someone who gets to an open area and gets in shooting position? Kind of automate the characterization of players like that to see who has the strengths and weaknesses, what sort of players to pair up together to kind of build off of each other's strengths. And also to characterize how quickly teams close on the puck carrier and how that results in turnovers. All these sort of things are possible. And then including characterization of player passing ability as well. You can characterize all the passing events that occur within individual games as well. And obviously, the biggest challenge for this is how much of the new data is going to be available to the general analytics community versus just team analytics departments and the NHL's business partners. So hopefully some of that data gets out there, hopefully as much as possible, but we'll have to wait and see what exactly gets out there. And that's my slide. So I guess if you guys have any questions now, feel free, or just talk to me after at the next break. Thank you.
All right, and perfect timing for him to say, talk to you about the next break, because it's time for a break. So we're gonna take a 10-minute break, and we're gonna be back here at, we'll say, all right, we're gonna call it a 9-minute break. Be back here at 2:25.
Yeah.
If you want to try sorry, half iron and break. As long as a lot of time. I'm like, so my friends who want to hang out want to hang out. I tried to listen to it earlier, but they had I had lots of follow-ups. I wanted to say, I wanted to ask one thing. Relates back to the base. So.
It's because you know what all the bus up to? I've been there.
Yeah, no, I agree. So the more I like to look at
So Colin City Finals podcast.
It's built up a ladder.
He's streaming them live.
Well, we did, because we love the story so much. So we need the videos.
Nice.
I have to go by the tech. I don't know how to. The avatar is your avatar. Yeah. Whereas. I don't know how to. It's like a parody. That's the best way.
On Friday.
But having one of the top, one chick kept jumping in hungry all inside. And so we had to call his mother, and I went to the restaurant, so we got to watch.
One hour.
And that's
I'm not sure.
I don't mind. The only good thing in my life. Drive it often. It's basically just
to go around. That was her call.
Yeah, I thought it was gonna yeah, I'm really because they still like, well, I don't want the attention, it's kind of hard to so like, it's kind of, it's one, yeah, I gotta, like, when I came in from that shirt, I was like, I drew that. I've been doing that shirt. Yeah, I saw someone has my, someone has it on their site here. Yeah, I saw someone yesterday who has that. I drew that. How do you stick it on? Oh, yeah, yeah.
You said it.
Honestly, we drove from Vancouver down, and then drove to the gas, and then just
Testing.
Oh no, there's definitely like this novel. It's just like tumbleweed go aside and like I don't think I've ever used one in real life, but then I of course, yeah, you can do that one.
Okay, same thing. Okay, all right. Never seen
All right, we are going to get back to it, folks. Believe it or not, we only have two more, I guess you call them segments. We have one more presentation, and then we have our lightning talks, and that's pretty much it for SeaHAC, believe it or not. So, okay, our next guest, I'm really excited about this one, as you're going to find out in just a second when I tell you that this gentleman spent 5 years doing data analysis for the Minnesota Wild. So, okay, wow. Not as many Wild fans as I thought. He more recently served as the first ever statistical consultant to the law firm Miller Thompson, with which he worked on a dozen arbitration cases this past offseason. He currently consults for teams all across the nation, multiple nations, sports. Yeah, multiple sports. And his talk is going to be on player evaluation. This is Ben Resnick.
Thanks very much.
All right, so before we begin, let's, like everybody, a big hand for the organizers, the people helping with the technical stuff and the food. This whole weekend's been amazing and exciting. All right, great. So what I'm going to give you today is probably not exactly what you'd expect, or maybe not what you're hoping for if you're looking for a really data-heavy talk and going into a lot of modeling. So I apologize in advance for that. But what I kind of wanted to do instead was to try and give a little bit of a different perspective and share a lot of the actual mechanics of how things work to try and tie it back to data. So let me give you a little bit of a roadmap of what I'm going to hope to accomplish here. So I'll start by getting you a little bit more about me. Then we'll try and at least get a little common language to talk about player contracts, free agency, and the negotiation process. We'll try and dive then into a specific example from this past summer that I worked on with Paramount. We'll look at Joel Edmondson, who's a restricted free agent with the Blues. And then we'll both try, I'm going to show you a data approach and then try and go through the actual traditional approach that happened. And then we'll just sort of close quickly to talk about what's next for Edmonton and the Blues, and then I'll just take some general questions. So about me a little bit, I describe myself as an economist first. I certainly have a background in applied stats as well. Undergrad, I went to Syracuse University. I was a journalism and economics major. Grad school at University of Pennsylvania, where it was all econ. From 2012 through 2017, I was in various titles doing data analysis for the Wild. And then this past summer, I worked for Miller Thompson. So the way you guys may or may not know, once players or clubs elect to go to arbitration, every club is going to go and hire outside counsel to both prepare their brief that will get submitted, and they'll also use that counsel to present at the hearing itself. There are only 2 law firms in the league that do this, and it's really about 3 lawyers that end up doing it. Miller Thompson's a group that the Wild's used for years. I knew them from my time there, and this summer when I was available, I was talking to their attorneys, who are both terrific guys who have a dozen years of experience just doing arbitration hearings on their own. And so we thought there may be some fit, because there started to be some tendencies to see a little bit more data-heavy brief starting to show up. Everything that we're going to talk about when we get to the briefs comes down to stats, but the stats that are getting in there are starting to change very slowly. And so that was the thought of maybe I would have a little bit of a different perspective when we talk about it. So there's sort of a dual motivation to my talk today, to be honest with you. On the hockey side, we're going to try and understand a little bit more about arbitration itself. And the reason it matters so much is it's a way for teams to either carve out or lose some cap space depending on how well you do in a negotiation, or if something gets away from you, either because it goes to a hearing or because you sort of cave and make a contract happen. And that's just a reality of the job. But if you have 2 or 3 players that are all arbitration eligible, even if it's a case of $250,000, $300,000 for each player cap hit wise, when you aggregate it, could be the difference of an extra player on the roster or a trade you can't make at the deadline. So every little bit matters. And so from a hockey sense, that's where it is. But then to bring it sort of into this room, I think a real big takeaway and something that I learned over my time in Minnesota is you can build a really good model with the tools that a lot of people in here have. And you can probably get a pretty good prediction of what happens a lot of the time just from the data that you have and the techniques that you use. The catch is, if you don't understand the underlying process that's generating your data, when your model fails, you won't know why. I'd like to think that I did something in Minnesota for 5 years, aside from draw a paycheck, and hopefully that shows up as building up some institutional knowledge. And that's sort of what I want to try and share today is, I think a lot of people in here could really understand and build a quick model to get an idea of salary, but then let's talk about where the real world sort of takes a turn because of what the CBA says and try and understand it. So to get everybody on the same page here, we're going to talk a little bit about player contracts. I'll probably abbreviate them SBCs throughout here, and to try and really help sort of guide things. If anybody's really serious about working for a club, knowing the details really matter. And everything that's going to come up here early on comes straight from the CBA. You can go online and find it and download it. If you want to understand the rules, you have to know where to look. Clubs do have access to the central registry, which is a part of the league that will inform them and guide them on all this stuff. But this is sort of the key points that'll sort of drive us into being able to talk about some hard stuff. So once contracts are set, There is no concept of renegotiation. Any contract that's going to be extended is going to be a new deal when the current one's done. Players can't walk away. Clubs cannot terminate contracts aside from buyouts. Contracts are limited pretty strictly both on the amount of money that can be in them. There's a minimum and then there's a maximum that never really is binding, but it is in the CBA. And then the number of years is also restricted. Bonuses are relatively rare. Signing bonuses are just money you get because you signed a deal. It's basically money paid up front rather than as a salary. And then the only other bonuses that can be in there at all are performance bonuses. They almost exclusively appear in entry-level deals. Very few class of veteran players coming off injuries can also qualify for them. But at the end of the day, player contracts are pretty simple. You're going to talk about a contract length or term, and then how much they're going to get paid over the life of it. Those two things get put together to calculate a player's cap hit. It's the AAV. It's how essentially the average of what a player is going to get paid across the number of seasons he's there, and that's his cap hit each year. So to try and drill down to the group of players that we're going to talk about, CBA determines what sort of rights every player has when they're contracted. And as you're in the league longer, you're able to negotiate more freely until you become a full-on free agent. The group that I'm going to talk about today are restricted free agents. There's also called Group 2 free agents in the CBA. This is painting with a very broad brush because I'm not going to waste everybody's time with a lot of details, but to give you an idea of what they look like, they're typically guys on their second or third contract in the league, maybe fourth, and oftentimes they're going to be aged 22 to 26. So a lot of the guys, especially the ones that would come up in arbitration, are sort of established in the league, but certainly are young players, not somebody who has a reputation based on a long history. For players to become Group 2 free agents or restricted, clubs have to give them a qualifying offer or a QO. It's basically an offer of a one-year contract. The terms of it are listed out very clearly by the CBA, and a player could sign that right away, know they have a deal and be done. In practice, that's just a starting point for a negotiation. It's very rare that somebody actually accepts a qualifying offer. But once one is sent, the process is going forward now, and the club will retain some special rights that they wouldn't have if the player were an unrestricted free agent. Of that group of restricted free agents, some of them, based on how long they've been in the league, will also qualify for arbitration. So players can accept that QO right on the spot and sign it. If they don't, they're going to continue to negotiate with the club until there's a deal made. Once they've received a QO, they also can sign an offer sheet, which is a contract proposed to them by any other club in the league. The reason the team gives a player a QO is to get some special rights. So if you made a player a qualifying offer, then he turns around and signs an offer sheet with somebody else, you have the option to match the contract exactly. Then the player is yours. He can't go to the new team. And if you choose to let the player go, depending on the size of the contract he signed, you get some draft pick compensation. So once we're in this world of qualifying offers and restricted free agency, both player and club, for players who have played enough games, will have the option to elect arbitration. Whoever does not elect arbitration picks how long the contract coming out of the arbit hearing will be, either 1 or 2 years. Once we're in the window where arbitration has been elected, the offer sheet goes out the window. There is sort of an exception for when it's club elected, there's a short window still for that to happen. But so sort of the more practical process of what happens at this point, this would be in the summer, end of June, July. Both sides would just continue negotiating essentially as normal. You're trying to find the right deal that fits for everybody, and knowing that now that you're in this arbitration process, if nobody reaches a deal by the hearing date, you're going to go into a binding process where everybody has to take what's going to happen. The arbitrator is going to pick a salary based on the club's argument and the player's argument that they think is fair. The only restriction is if a player's been earning a certain amount, it can't be below 85% of what he got the previous year. But if you're familiar with baseball arbitration, for example, it's a very different set of rules because in baseball's arbitration setup, the arbitrator picks between the two proposals. The club and the player each submit a number, and the arbitrator says it's that one or it's that one. But instead, yes, the club and player both submit a number. The NHL's arbitration process can lead to a number in the middle, it can lead to a number exactly one of the proposals, or it can even be outside either of them. A few years ago, we were just talking about it at lunch. The arbitrator actually awarded something that was below the club's offer because he felt the club's case was much stronger than the players. The big picture of arbitration and the whole point is, let's try and find some players who are similar, who are in a similar contract situation, so other arbitration eligible restricted free agents. And let's try and find the players who are most similar, see what the market valued them, and that's what the player's award should be. So let's try and talk about what that means by being a little bit more concrete, and we'll look at Joel Edmondson. He was a 25-year-old defenseman. He elected for arbitration this summer. The Blues decided to go for a one-year award, and what ended up happening is both sides exchanged their briefs, so they became public. They were going to prepare for a hearing, but before the hearing actually happened, both sides settled on a contract. It was signed, and that's the end of it. Things can get as far down the road, though, as having a hearing, and then player and team still have until the ruling is issued to continue to negotiate. It's rare, but it can happen that even after the entire hearing, there's still some middle ground, and everybody signs a contract, and then what the arbitrator would have ruled never comes out. But if you do get to the decision being issued, there is no negotiation on either side. It's the contract you live with. So to start, when we talk about Edmondson, I thought I'd try and sort of speak a lot of the language of things that people in here have probably seen, may even be almost bored of. Let's take a data-driven approach to answer it, because I'm sure a lot of people are very familiar with Matt Cain's work, and Matt and I were sort of talking about this. He was gracious enough to say, hey, you know, if you want to try and speak about what Edmondson's worth, here's my approach. So I'm going to give you the 30-second version of Matt Cain's approach, which will be not nearly the justice it deserves. So feel free to tweet at Matt and tell him I did such a bad job. Essentially, though, Matt's model is the reason I talked to Matt, I should add too, is of all the models that are out there that I've seen publicly, Matt's is, in my opinion, the best and it is up to industry standard. It's very similar to what a club could use if they were interested in trying to answer something like this. The approach he took is, for a given length of contract and a player who's performed the way he has, what's the player's AAV going to be? The data that Matt uses to figure it out, he has some biographical data, so it's, things like age, nationality, height and weight, his contract history and status, because at the end of the day, somebody who's unrestricted versus a restricted free agent will be paid very differently. And then Matt uses performance stats from the last 3 seasons. He compares everything to a league average, and then he gets a prediction. So I went to Matt and I said, hey, you know what? Let's only talk about 1-year contracts because the club's already elected it. So we're trying to get a sense of what should the outcome be for Edmondson based on what he's done and the fact that he's arbitration eligible. Matt's model says AAV of just a hair over $2.4 million for 1 season. Matt goes a step further to try and give people a big picture of the summer. And so he tries to project how long the contract he'll get. And he told me, hey, you know what? It's interesting that it ends up being a 1-year award because he's only 60% likely to get that. Matt's model expected Edmondson to get at least 2 or 3 years. So we'll kind of switch gears though and say, all right, let's set aside the data result for a minute and let's talk about the actual process that has happened. We're in a world now where the arbitration election has already been made. Both sides know that they're going to go to it. There's no more outside option to negotiate with another club. The leverage that's going to happen on both sides of this negotiation is basically against what you think is going to come out of the hearing. And keep in mind that this hearing, the goal of it, both sides are going to present their own case,
and we're going to try and find a fair market value for the player. And you're going to do that by trying to find comparable players. Both the briefs and the hearings really, really focus on that. There are some sort of big picture things at the start of who a player is and the team that he's on and sort of that context. But the nitty gritty of both negotiations that would happen between agent and club and the meat of the hearings and the most important part of the briefs are all about finding these players who are both similar in statistics, similar in role on a team, and are also arbitration eligible. So we're going to talk about comps, and the question really is what's going to make the best comps, because that's how both sides are going to be building their case. And if you take one thing away from the whole talk today, it should be this. The one thing that matters the most to be a good comp is games played. At the end of the day, if one player's been in the league and played a season or a season and a half more than another, it's not going to be a great comp, and there's going to be a way to argue away from it. But when player performance certainly is going to matter a lot, but the peers that you're trying to establish are the guys who have been in the league for a similar amount of time. Once you have that, the question is really using the stats that are available to try and talk about that specific player's role and use within the team. So what sort of special teams opportunities does he have or doesn't he have? What line does he play in? And sort of what extra elements does he bring to a team? The more recent the contract has been signed, the better the comp is. Ideally, all of your comps would be ones that are signed in the same summer you're negotiating. So for Edmondson, you'd want to see contracts that were all from 2018. 2017 is reasonable. 2016 starts to get a little bit of a stretch, and the further away you get, the less compelling they are. Because again, the argument you're making to an arbitrator is, this is what the market values someone as today. So how the market valued a player like Edmondson in 2015 doesn't matter. And then the other thing that will really help too is, or at least maybe not muddy the waters, if the contracts that you're calling comparable are of a similar length, it's very clean. If you say that somebody who is signed a 6 or a 7 years comparable, and you're talking about a 1 or a 2 year award, well, how do you sort of get sort of agreement between what's a player valued at in year 1 of a 6 year deal? If it's a 1 or a 2 year deal, it's sort of obvious what the player's valued at in the market in year 1 or year 2. But when you get to a 6 year deal, there's arguments both sides. You know, you might argue that the player's taking less money because he's getting some security. You might argue that, you know what, the player is getting overpaid in the first few years because there's sort of a smoothing. The team says, if we're going to go into this long-term relationship, we're not going to worry about grinding you down for every dollar year 1 and year 2 and then paying you off when you could be an unrestricted free agent. Instead, if you're going to end up earning $24 million over the 6 years, we'll just give you $4 million a year, even though your rights would be different at the start and the end of that contract. And if you did 1 year deals the whole way, you wouldn't get that same amount. So let's start by trying to show you guys what the team's going to do to approach things. So the team comp in this case, they put together a list. Now, when this list goes to the arbitrator, the names are actually going to be up there, and I'll show you guys in a minute. But I wanted to start by showing you the stats without the names, so that way any sort of biases you might have in your mind about the players involved won't show up. A couple of things to note about this up here. So first, the term career to platform is over there at the top, and what that means, platform year is the last year that the player has played, right up until the day he signs his contract. So guys who are in the off season, the platform year is just the season they completed. If you sign mid-season, your platform year is whatever you've done so far that season. Comp pools are typically made for both career to platform, which is essentially the body of your work for your whole career, and just platform year comps. And that's what you did this most recent season. The players that are the most compelling are a comp in both the platform year and career to platform. One other oddity that just shows up because of the nature of the way the briefs are done, if you notice the time on ice columns here, they're decimal time rather than actually the way time is done. And that's just sort of an artifact of how the system is done. And so I wanted to recreate it so you guys get a little more of an idea of exactly what that is.
So the first couple of columns there are going to show what players were compensated for, the length of the contracts. It was important to note there that some of those deals, two of them, players A and player C, include some UFA years. In those years, the player would have more rights. The club no longer can control what the player does when he goes to negotiate. There's no right to match. There's no threat of arbitration. So a player is going to be fully valued by the free market. And in that case, he's going to get paid more. So when AAB on player A's deal is $2.35 million, but 2/3 of the contract is unrestricted, there's a real argument that the valuation of what 1 year for player A is worth is less than 2.35. So sort of take a second here to take things in, and I'm sort of open to hearing some thoughts on what people see. I think it's very fair to say that these stats are really rudimentary. They certainly aren't anything too deep about the game, and it may even frustrate you to see something like plus minus on there. Just maybe, right? But the reality is that that's a part of the arbitration process, and for one side or the other, plus minus is going to paint a favorable picture. And whoever does is certainly going to bring it into the hearing. And if the arbitrator decides, like a lot of people in here would, that plus minus doesn't actually matter, okay. But maybe they're swayed a little bit and all of a sudden it strengthens your case. So this is a few of the stats that would normally show up. It would be pretty rare, although we're starting to get to some more context-driven stats. Things like zone starts are starting to creep into the conversation in a few briefs. Shot attempts, again, especially I think if either side feels they have a weak case on traditional stats, they're going to sort of fall back and then start to try and bring in something else that's official from the league that has a little more weight. A couple of things just to note, though. I know a lot of people always say, well, can't wait till we get tracking data. It's going to change everything. The current agreement between the league and the union will make those not admissible for arbitration. So that's not going to change overnight. To my knowledge, I've never seen any sort of real advanced statistic that a team has calculated, some metric they've come up in-house, ever appear in an argument. And there's even a requirement that teams disclose to the union any stats that they keep in-house on players before the briefs are exchanged. So, all right, we've had a couple of seconds here. This is sort of staring at the face. People sort of call out what they see. Do players A through E feel like they answer the question, who's similar to Joel Edmondson?
Sure.
All right, any concerns, things that strike you as sort of off? One thing, for example, is, again, if you just go to games played alone, let's look at player D versus Edmondson. It's almost a full season difference. Right away, that's going to be a little bit of a difficult comp. So I'll show you the names. These are the ones that the club has submitted are the guys who are most similar to Edmondson. And thus they're saying this is how the market values players like that. If you have any reaction that's different as players' names come in, that's fine. You may look at somebody and it may spark something in your head that says, well, hey, hold on a minute. I think that Van Riemsdyk, for example, doesn't have some of the elements that Edmondson does. I think a fair way to describe what Edmondson's career and data said is coming in, he's probably a third pairing defenseman. Maybe he can play up in the second pair some, but largely he sort of is a bigger body. He actually has a decent shot that led to a higher scoring rate than some other players, but he doesn't move the puck the way Van Riemsdyk does. So if I were working for the player side when I saw this, right away I'd be trying to figure out, well, Van Riemsdyk is probably a puck-moving guy. He's going to statistically look different. Maybe you focus on the fact that Edmondson's penalty minute rate and hit rate are both way, way above Van Riemsdyk's. And then you can say, you know what, Van Riemsdyk isn't a good comp. Throw him out. Your argument's going to be to try and take away all of the low-salary players that the other side has put forward. There'd be a lot more tables in this in a single brief. The briefs can be up to 50 pages. They typically end up in that 40 to 45 page range. So I'll try and summarize some of the other things that the team said. For example, on the career to platform side, like I mentioned, Edmonton's nearly a full season ahead on games played alone. So those comps are a little bit weak in that sense. The different penalty rate, again, means he may have a different style of the way he plays the game. And then one thing I would toss out is there's a big risk that the club faces. I didn't put it up there because goal scoring rates for defensemen are not informative, but goals get paid. 30 goal scorers always get a big bump over guys who have scored 28, 29 goals. 20 goal scorers get a big bump over guys who have scored fewer. So if the arbitrator latches onto the fact that, well, you've given me 5 comps, but Edmondson scores more than all of them, he may just put Edmondson right ahead of those guys right away. So in my opinion, there's a real risk that if you pick a pool where every player is below your guy on a certain stat, the arbitrator may conclude, you know what, your guy's better than his whole pool, he should be paid more. There'd be a similar table made up for just platform year stuff. And an interesting thing that sort of comes out that again is, in my opinion, a little bit tough for the St. Louis case. Edmondson led all players in that pool that they put forward in time and ice per game and in goals. He had a career high that year, he scored 10. Now, as a part of St. Louis's argument, they tried to explain, now hold on, we had a bunch of injuries, we traded a player because we were out of it at the deadline. So Edmondson's role was really, really larger than it had been, so he looked statistically better. But the reality is, as he played more, the team got worse. And it was the first time that we missed the playoffs since he'd been on the roster. And then one last note that I want to toss up here that's pretty important. The last comp, Pouliot, he's listed as a comp by the club side, and in my opinion, it's completely ridiculous, and it's sort of a subtle reason why. He didn't receive a qualifying offer. That meant he became an unrestricted free agent. He was out in the market. There was no right for anybody to match. There was no restriction on who he could negotiate with. There was no threat of arbitration. So how does a player who's in that scenario reflect the market value of somebody who is restricted and who can go to arbitration? In my opinion, it's really easy to argue Pouliot out right away. I think that the club made a real reach to try and include him in the brief, and I advised against it at the time because I think it's something that the player side can latch onto and say, there's no way it's relevant. So the player side came back and they said Edmondson's worth $3.75 million for a year. They offered up 3 comps. There are 2 things that should jump out right away in my opinion. First, all 3 players that they offered up had at least one unrestricted free agent year in the deal. The carrot actually didn't show up, so I apologize for that, but all 3 deals are also a year old. So none of the players they offered up had signed a contract within the last 12 months to show the current market value. And every single one of them have some unrestricted years that are going to be paid more than the restricted years. So again, you can take a look here at the stats though and try and decide and sort of think to yourself about, are these guys reflective of what Edmondson is, or is there something meaningfully different here? So I'll toss up the names here. And at the end of the day, the question is going to come down to, and this is really oversimplifying it, but do you think Edmondson's more like the 5 names the club put forward, or is he a more similar player to Dumoulin, Manson, and Pissick? To try and give a little bit of a summary of what I saw in the player stuff. First of all, Edmondson's older than all those guys, or than Dumoulin and Manson. And if you notice, Dumoulin and Manson are the 2 who are really driving that number up. In my opinion, between the 2 sides, Pissick's the best comp for Edmondson that anybody put forward. You could easily argue that based on what Pissick is, you're a year later, maybe Edmondson gets 2.75, something in that range. The player ask is driven up by the other 2 names that are in there. But the reality is, Edmondson's a more established player. That career to platform number of games that he's played puts him ahead of those guys. But then at the same time, he's playing less per game than both Dumoulin and Manson. They're guys who are younger, but have been given a bigger and more important role on the team than Edmondson has. So is the way that they're paid a real reflection of how the market values a guy like Edmondson, or is it a reflection of how the market values younger players who are going to be top 4 or top pairing defensemen later in their careers? And it's up to the player side to try and argue that maybe that is exactly what Edmondson is. But from the data that's here, I'm a little skeptical. The other thing that's really specific to Dumoulin, his contract was signed after the team won the Stanley Cup. He played in the top pairing the entire playoffs. Now, I know that a lot of people are going to say statistically, playoffs are a small sample. Like, this isn't exactly a revelation that the player's a lot better. But the reality is the market's going to value somebody differently that's coming off of a championship than somebody that didn't even make the playoffs when he was a second pairing guy. So for me, Dumoulin's contract is a function of Pittsburgh's success and the fact that as he stepped into a larger role, the team got better. Edmonton's story is the opposite of that. Manson, while having fewer games played, looks similar in some ways, but he has a much stronger physical element to his game, both penalty minutes, hits. And if you talk to a scout, they'd say the same thing. And then the other thing that's going to be a real argument too is Manson's plus minus is a step away from Edmondson's. And again, as much as you may feel a certain way about the stat, if we're trying to argue that Manson's a strictly better defenseman and doesn't reflect who Joel Edmondson is, that's something that the club's going to latch onto. Like I mentioned before, I think a real weakness of this brief is every single contract they put up is both old and has unrestricted free agent years. If a player has signed a contract that has only UFA years, it's not admissible for arbitration at all. It's not relevant. It's a different market entirely. So the question that I keep coming back to is, are the comps that they put forward a really good way to describe how the market values Joel Edmondson? And so there's a lot of pressure there. And the interesting part is that they settled. And hopefully, as we've started talking, you guys have thought about what Edmondson's going to be worth. And I was surprised personally. I thought that St. Louis settled at a pretty high number. So here's sort of a little bit of context of it. So he was coming off getting paid $1.2 million in the previous season. The team said he was worth 1.75. Remember, Matt Cain's model, which I thought did a really good job as giving a general summary, said 2.4. If you think Pizik alone is the best, he's probably 2.75. And the club came in at 3 and agreed with the player. And my guess is that they were worried that the hearing could get away. And something that doesn't really show up here and isn't going to be a part of the brief, but is definitely a part of the club's decision-making process. St. Louis already had essentially a full roster at this time in the summer, and they had less than $2 million in cap space if they wanted to carry 23 players. So there's some risk that if the player side has made a really good argument, or if the arbitrator just doesn't like a couple of players that the club has put forward, and this hearing gets away from them, they may actually end up losing enough cap space that they have to make a separate roster move if they don't want to. And as much as I would argue that $3 million is a little bit of an overpayment, and it's the market moving too much for one platform year, the club may be willing to do that just to take away any risk that their salary cap gets distorted. And then over there at the end, the player asked for 375, which, like I said, I thought was a little high, but it ends up that the settlement is almost a midpoint between what player and club asked. So there was certainly ground to negotiate there. And instead of finding sort of a common ground in the briefs, there wasn't even a single player shared as a comp in both briefs. They were able to find that negotiating before the hearing happened. So what's next? Where do we go from here? Edmondson's playing out this year. It's a one-year deal. He's making $3 million this summer coming up. He's going to be in almost exactly the same boat. He'll again be a restricted free agent. St. Louis is still going to have the opportunity to qualify him. If they do, that qualifying offer is going to be $3 million for next season. And then both sides will be eligible to elect arbitration. The player can always elect. Clubs can only elect on an individual player once in their career. Since the player elected this past year, the club could still elect to take him now. The interesting thing to note, though, Edmondson's going to be 26 this summer. He's a year away from becoming an unrestricted free agent. That means that the arbitration award can only be 1 year because it cannot go into unrestricted free agency. It can't hit that age 27 year. So if he does go into R, it's going to be a 1-year settlement, but club and player could negotiate a longer term deal if it turns out that Edmondson would want to try and stay there and the team wants to have him past age 26. So first and foremost, I'd like to thank Matt Kane for sort of offering up a little bit of a data approach to it. Matt was very helpful to me to sort of talk through a whole bunch of things. So if you thought what he did was great and really interesting, you should tweet him and tell him what a great job he did. If you didn't like anything that I did today or you thought it was a waste of your time, that's fine. You should tweet Matt and tell him associates with bad people. I'm not on Twitter, so just follow Matt. It's fine, right? But so with that, I'm happy to take questions, and we can sort of start by talking about some of the art stuff here, but then we can sort of move more general stuff. Oh, goodness. Well, let's start here and we'll sort of work around the room.
So when approaching arbitration, as arbitration gets near, is it like how people do like judges were like, oh, this judge is strict and this judge is lighter, and so like, oh, this person is the arbitrator, so they can decide, with penalty minutes or they really like plus minus or whatever.
That's a really good question. You do know which arbitrator will be hearing the case. A few of them tend to have a little bit of a bias one way or the other, but it typically is just if they lean towards club or player rather than if they're sympathetic to a specific stat argument. But the reality is each summer, the league and the union have the opportunity to exclude an arbitrator from all future hearings. So when Chason's deal came down a few years ago, the union just threw the guy out the next year. If he's going to award something below the club's ask, he's just not part of the process anymore. So I think that by having that mechanism, and at the end of the day, a bunch of the arbitrators have been in there a long time, the reality is they are fairly down the middle in terms of we're going to go to whatever the stats and the briefs say rather than favoring a club or a player or being flawed in one way that can be exploited. In the red sweater?
Yeah, just out of curiosity, of the 40 pages of the brief, how much of them are tables and exhibits versus actual text?
Ballpark, I would say that if the brief's 40 pages long, probably 25 to 30 will be text. And it's double spaced, and it's not a really long read. I'm a slow reader, and I can still get through the briefs pretty quickly. And also, a lot of it the first 6, 7, 8 pages are complete boilerplate that honestly everybody would be well served to just say, everybody's going to say, for the last 15 years, ARB has worked this way. The goal is to find similar players. So we're going to look to see how the market compensates them, and we cite this one case that happened first. It serves nobody any purpose. If you skip to page 10 and start reading, you get the same story.
First of all, thanks to that. I'm glad him and I were able to connect over lunch, and we learned that we're actually on the other side of the table for a particular arbitration case years ago. That was pretty fun to talk about. So I'm going to take advantage of Ben's invitation to chime in a little bit here, coming from the player's perspective. And
tell me what I did wrong.
Nothing.
Oh wow! No, go ahead.
I think one thing to remember from the player's perspective is the arbitration process is extremely stressful for players, and many players don't have the stomach for it. I think players generally want to play hockey and let the agent take care of the contract, and to go through the arbitration process for the player is very stressful, and the player has to fly to Toronto for the hearing, and then he has to sit in the courtroom for half an hour and listen to a lawyer tell him how much he sucks.
Yeah.
And, so it's never a fun process for the player, and I think in the most recent arbitration cases we've done, in each of them, only 1 or 2 comps, if that, are comparable between the briefs, because, for the team, we're going to try to bring in comps that provide the lowest value, and the agent's going to try to bring in comps that have the highest value. So, from our end, it's a little bit of, it's not a guessing game, but the art to it is to say, okay, what criteria are we going to use in a group of players to say we're comparable to? Are we going to, the best case scenario is to have 1 or 2 players that are absolute direct comparable players to your player, and have it simple, direct, comparable, same number, same age, same games played, same goals, assists, points, time on ice. You know, you really only need one player, and he's a direct comparable. And, you know, for if it's a contract that you like, to say, this is the guy, I want his contract, and that's the best way to do it.
Yeah.
Now, it's, you know, it's of course not linear like that, and nobody's ever, I should say, rarely a true comparable player. So the art to it is how wide of a group you want, and versus, you know, muddying the water, so to speak, to try to push the number up, versus narrowing the group to have maybe a little bit lower number, but a stronger, cleaner, simpler case. So I think from both sides look at the same thing. Do opposite cases. So you know, I think that's why, you know, you go in saying with the same question, okay, who's the most comparable player to Eric Ferguson, and you get two totally different answers.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean, on your slide there, I forgot who it was. If you want to go back to
You want the player ones or the club?
the So I would, to my understanding, actually the most impactful stat for defensemen as far as measuring defensive metrics is penalty kill time on ice.
Yeah.
So I would immediately throw out Stetcher, I would throw out Benning, I would throw out Pouliot.
I agree.
And, you know, then you can get to Johns and Riemsdyk, and the games played too. You guys are better anyway. And I think physics from the next slide is pretty close as well.
Yeah.
So I mean, you know, I'm just looking at this now. So
Yeah.
just from what I'm seeing, you know, in the 5 minutes we're talking about it, but you know, I think those guys are the three closest comparable players. You know, now, you know, the agent was right to bring in these other guys because they made the case stronger. You know, Gilmore and Mason have an A, B, or 4 and when they ended up with 5. If you only have Physic and the other two guys, I don't think you get it.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And so first of all, Sam, you could have given a better talk than I did, so you probably should.
We still have lightning talk slots open.
Honestly, I really appreciate you bringing it up, because that human element is really important. Because the hearing process really is costly, and it's something that's tough on people, and the clubs are even aware of it. If we think that we're going to get a really similar or the same number in a hearing as we would that we can agree to, then save everybody the hassle and the stress. Because like Sam said, a player then sits in a room, they sit with their agent, and there's an argument for 30 minutes that the club puts forward of all the reasons the player's terrible, and the reason he shouldn't be paid anything, the reason that they don't want him, except the reality is that they're going to turn around and sign him to a deal. Because you've reached the arbitration point, nobody's going to be able to walk away unless the award is, there is one CBA clause that you walk away, but it's very rare. So it creates a really strange dynamic, though, of we're negotiating with you, of course we want you, you're a part of this team, to a half hour of, these are all your flaws, 1 through 10. These are the reasons you shouldn't be paid. These are the reasons you're a problem for us. And then afterwards, hey buddy, come on back. Management, coaches, we love you. Let's go and play some hockey. And so I totally agree that that's both a real cost and something that we can strive to avoid, and I think everybody wants to.
Right. And I think it does cost some of them.
Yeah. Yeah, it can certainly change a long-term relationship. The gentleman with the glasses, you've been very patient, so I have time for 2 more here.
It seems like offer sheets don't happen anymore. Is that a concern for teams that it ever gets to that point? Or is it just kind of discounted that it's not going to even be a reality?
So I'm an economist, so I'll give you a real economist answer on offer sheets. And I think the reality is that they're really, really prone to winner's curse. Because you know that every other club has a right to match. And because clubs are not run by people who are really, really dumb. If you offer a player a reasonable deal, the one that he signs, it's just going to get matched. And at the end of the day, you've probably done the negotiating for the team. And at the end, it's just, there's going to be very little chance that you actually do anything to get a player away on an offer sheet.
but you'll probably get a lot of people mad at you in the process. And all of a sudden, other teams will be unhappy with sort of, for lack of a better term, the etiquette you didn't follow. And if that impacts you in a future negotiation with either another RFA or maybe in a trade, because all of a sudden now a GM says, well, if you offer sheet my guy, I'm not going to trade with you. The industry's small and it's a lot about relationships. So the fact that there's a low probability of an offer sheet working, unless you drastically overpay a player, really limits it. In the rare times where one would work, because maybe a team's pinched against the cap, a lot of times a trade gets put together. When Dougie Hamilton got traded to Calgary, the price that went back was almost exactly the draft picks that would have happened if Calgary just signed him to an offer sheet. So if a team really sees that they're going to lose a guy to an offer sheet, they'll just trade him and try and get some assets back. Maybe you're slightly better because you're all of a sudden giving another team that exclusive right rather than just letting them be the highest bidder. So last one, you said?
Yeah.
All right, Ryan.
That's like, this is a two-part. So
Oh, boy.
the first is kind of a.
You said you only get one.
Which part is more important?
So again, you mentioned, certain contextual stats, like zone starts now kind of creeping into some of these. Is there, given like available research and available data the league provides, is there something you wish you had and you in a team role back then? And what are like the pros and cons of this? And then the second part is that if you were still working for the Wild and you were getting comps on like, let's say, I don't know, Victor Rath's next contract, do you think you'd include me in a meter writer?
It's interesting. So the first part. The arbitration process has enough history and is really tied to a lot of the data. And so I guess I don't say that I really wish that there'd be something more available to me, because I'm working within the framework I have. Those are the rules of the game. And if you add more data, honestly, all it does is it becomes more work for Sam and I. It becomes even harder to actually find some common ground and figure out what a player is worth, because now instead of 20 stats, if we have 30 or 40 dimensions that we're going to try and sort of limit loss amongst all of them to find the most similar guy, the more data you add, the more it muddies the waters. And so I guess maybe the right answer is, if a contract's really getting away from me on the club side, and I need the number to be lower to make my cap work, or maybe because I don't think the player is worth that, I love extra things at my disposal to throw out and say, hold on, because of his zone starts, or because of his touches per 60 or pass completion percentage, he's different. But if I think the negotiation's going the way that I want any of that stuff in there. As far as the meter writer specific question, to be honest with you, it's going to depend on the stats, but the reality is that whoever it favors is certainly going to bring up they were traded 1-for-1. The two managers a few months ago viewed them as equal players. And so who brings that up and works it into their brief is going to depend entirely on if you think Niederreiter's contract helps your case or not. If you're trying to get Rask a number way under it, the Wild's going to have a pretty big burden to try and say why they are different. Versus on the other hand, if it turns out that Niederreiter's contract's now a few years old, and that's going to be the one part that pushes it away. If the player side wants to get away from it, they're going to say it's a few years old, here are the reasons it's different. So one side's going to care and the other side's going to hate it. So, all right. Thank you everybody so much for your time.
All right, I was promised 30 minutes of wild talk, and the only wild talk I got was Niederreiter Rask trades. So, ouch. Okay, we are going to roll right into our lightning talks. This is our last little segment here. So, all right, who are you pointing at? Okay, RJ, you're the first lightning talker, so come on down. Let's hear it for RJ. What's that?
All right, everybody, lightning talks are beginning now.
Hi, everyone. My name is RJ, and I am puck possessed, as many of you are. Some of you may have seen me last year at the SeaHAC in 2018, where I briefly talked about displaying shot data in a more user-friendly way in the 3D version. And you may have also seen my name on the Hockey Abstract 2018 update by Rob Fallman, where I helped him this year to graphically enhance it a little bit. And lastly, there was a question last year if I was related to Dillies. I still have not been able to convince him that that is the case. And on the side here, I do a lot of Tableau work. That's kind of what brings me to this conference. Playing with the data, obviously, like many of you do. And I mostly visualize the data in Tableau. And that's also what I do for a living. What I'm talking about is mostly for these two guys, my two sons, 5 and 7 years old, that play in a nice backyard rink, and I'm sure they're going to be superstars. I'm not sure it's going to be in the NHL, given my height and my wife's 5'2" height. Who knows, but by that time, maybe speed and skill are so important that height doesn't matter anymore, so you never know. But if building a backyard rink and playing with Tableau in the time that you're not working is not nerdy enough, I also paint these types of figures, the McFarlane figures, and if there's any fans around here, you'll know that unfortunately they don't make them anymore. They sold it to a different company that makes awful figures. And without being too pushy, my kids, of course, need to be a little exposed to that as well. I don't know if anybody knows these. The average age here doesn't lead you to be thinking you have kids yet, so you'll get there, you'll get there. Anyway, so I was listening to a podcast where Ryan was one of the speakers, and he had given the advice to never talk about a book until it's actually finished, because otherwise people would keep asking you when it's done. I'm going to ignore that. I'm going to tell you that I am working on a book. My big advantage is that I have no drive to finish it anytime soon. I'm doing it purely as a hobby. So I just wanted to share with you that I am working on a book that really focuses on the visual aspects of data analysis and visualization of hockey graphs. And the goal is more to really make a book that I can show to my kids when they're a bit older, introduce them to some mathematical concepts, etc., but all in a fun way to look at. I've always had an obsession with visuals. You can see a picture here from my some screenshots of my personal collections. I don't know if there's any soccer fans in here, but I thought this Ajax against Real Madrid picture from 1973 was very timely. As you may know, Ajax beat Real Madrid 4-1 in Madrid. And if you read Ryan's book, you'll see that it all goes back to Johan Cruyff and Rinus Michels, who were part of the inspiration of his book, if I'm not incorrect here. Anyway, visual storytelling I think is important. We do see a lot of graphs and talks about math and stats that are very interesting and sometimes hard to understand for people that are not really into that. So that's kind of a niche that I'm trying to fill with cool and fun stuff, and also, as I said, expose some of those mathematical ideas to kids at a younger age. So far I've built about 15 of them, and I'm just publishing them through Twitter. Some of them are interactive and use Tableau as part of the visualization. Some are just strictly infographics almost, and I'll just highlight a few of them. Here I'm looking at some analysis on power plays of 2 minutes, and then looking at where teams actually score. And at the top graph, you can see that over the 120 seconds of the power play and where the teams fall. And then I created this arc to show that a little clearer. and again, in a visually attractive and fun way. Another thing I did was looking at the nationalities of the players in the NHL, and I think we all know how our friend Don Cherry thinks about that. But I also found a picture from, I believe, the 1700s in the Netherlands where they played something like hockey already, so we could have a good argument about that over a beer in the pub later on. I'll quickly go through this. This is just a visual of Pettersson looking at Bosser, trying to get the puck behind the defense, and going to do an imitation of the Swedish chef, but I'll skip that because the time's almost done. Here's an infographic of just the type of shot attempts and how they are divided between the different options. And this is one of those interactive ones where you can pick your own player. I'll quickly go through here. Here's some face-offs, but the scenarios can be handpicked, so you can say who's the best face-off taker, where you're one man down and you are in the offensive zone, for example. This is about money. There's free money here. These are all bills for $79.5 million. I'll leave them here in case you want to take one home, but this is one of those things where you spend more on something simple like this that almost disappears in the actual visual, but it was fun to do. But like I said, I have some lying around here if you're interested. And the main reason I'm bringing this up is I would love to hear some tips or feedback and comments from either people that have written books or after seeing this that have some ideas that I may not have thought about. And even if you feel like I'm on completely the wrong track, I'd love to hear it from you. So thank you very much.
Okay, Carly Markey.
Yeah, about time, right, guys?
Yeah. I like how we all went down like the exact same time.
Okay, so hi, I'm Carly. Oh, sorry. I'm Carly, and I'm here to talk about visualizing WHL data. So, of the two women's leagues that exist in North America, only one of them has play-by-play data, and that is the NWHL. And it looks like, how do I turn this? Like that. No, that is not it. Oh my gosh, that. I'm sorry. And so when I first saw this, I was like, okay, number one question, how can I get all these shots from every single game in like every single season into one spot? And that answer came last August when Jake Lancer released an R script designed to scrape NWHL play-by-play data. And also when I finally learned how to use R in Tableau. Oh, yeah, there we go, sorry. So this is what the data looks like after it comes out of R and into Google Sheets. Functionally, it's really similar to NHL play-by-play in that it has like the XY coordinates and the event angle and distance and player and all these other useful variables that you can plug right into Tableau. And this beautiful color splash comes out the other end. And it is about 13,000 game events that represents pretty much every face-off, turnover, shots, blocked shots, goal, and penalty. And that's happened in the last 3 seasons of the NWHL. Now you can filter that by a couple of different parameters. This format is particularly good for looking at shot locations and other stuff for individual players. And as an example, this is Maddie Aaliyah from the, she's the leading goal scorer of the 2018-19 season in the NWHL. And there's something interesting here in that she's currently shooting at a 23.1 shooting percentage.
which is actually almost twice what it was last year for her. And this is last year's shot chart for her. And you can tell that she's kind of shooting from the same spots, right? And her shooting percentage was exactly half of what it was this year. So the basic conclusion you can kind of get from a chart like this is that, you know, you can tell that more luck. She's had more luck this year, leading to increased goal totals. Finally, in January of this year, I finally figured out how to use the density option for Tableau. And this is awesome because it's way better for using, or for looking at higher shot volumes. And for example, here are your NWHL regular season champions, the Minnesota Wild. Very consistently, they've had a really high number of shots from really optimal spots, right in the center of the ice. And this matches up with their offensive output this year, which they've typically outscored their opponents by roughly a goal and a half. And for contrast, this is the Connecticut Whale, who finished last in the standings. They have significantly less like shot hotspots, and all 3 or 4 of those hotspots can actually be attributed to basically three players: Katrina Misrova, Michelle, I'm going to butcher her last name, Lovenhelm, and Emily Fluke, which is never a good thing. And this might be stretching it a little bit, but I think there's some indication here in these charts that the whale shots are getting pushed to the outside at that Royal Road area where they're getting like lower quality shots, which matches up actually with their offensive production season, which also has been lowest in the league, unfortunately. And the third and final visualization I'm going to talk about is this one, shot rates at various strengths. And that was exactly what it says on my label. And when I created this in January, it kind of came off of those other 2 shot charts. And I wanted to see how those charts, like the shot volume, evolved over the season. And I'm going to skip the conclusion, but it's interesting. Okay, never mind. So there does seem to be some indication that the shot volume at even strength does match up with standings during the regular season. So what's the benefits of all this? Why am I making these pretty charts? Well, access point for everyone. It's always good to have more stats, especially in around women's hockey, where there aren't a lot of analytics being done. But there are people, we'll get to that in a second. But it's always good to have more when you have nothing. In addition to this, we're creating and maintaining an NWHL play-by-play data sets that are publicly available for anybody to work with, so please. Finally, these are all the other women's hockey viz creators. I highly recommend following them, and especially Ellis Longer. She has her website, evenstrength.com. Mike Murphy does really great research. Chris Giants on Twitter does awesome goalie stuff, and Shayna Goldman also does incredible women's hockey viz. And that's all.
Joshvina, you're up next.
There we go.
Hi, so everyone knows I'm the one who's obsessed with college hockey. I changed my idea for my lightning talk like 10 times, but then Hannah said that because originally I was going to be like, oh, I hate analytics, which isn't true, but we don't use them for a very specific reason. So Hannah was like, you should talk about how you can only use the eye test to differentiate between college hockey conferences. So I'm going to go back to my Jimmy Vesey and Cal Connor example, because I think back then it was a little bit more clear in terms of how different each conference was, and then to decide what type of player you're going to get out of that conference. So if you look at something like the NCHC, you're way more likely to get someone who's older and I would say like stronger and slightly more developed. You're going to go to the ECAC, you're probably going to get a player who's a little bit more defensive. If you go to the Big Ten, you're most likely going to get a player who's just run and gun offense, just crap like that. So the problem with trying to rely on statistics is that this is great. I think the Big Ten produced like, I don't know, 5 of the top 10 scorers that year. But on the flip side of that, you had players like Payne Jones. I don't even remember who the other goalies were. But anyway, they all sucked because nobody had defense. So if you looked at it, it was just like Ohio State would win like 8-7, which you can look at the score of that and you can say, okay, like they both just have really good offenses. But if you actually watched is when you would realize that it's just because they don't have defense. And it wasn't even always the goaltending thing. If you watched Ohio State back then, they were very much a team that would basically just like kind of crush you in transition offense, but there was no structure to anything they were doing, which is actually why they're more successful now than they were back then, because they have a defense and it makes a difference. So with the ECAC, now same thing, like Jimmy Vesey, the players in that league are very rarely ever leading the standings in scoring, or the scoreboard for stats leaders. And you can look at it 2 ways. If you look at it and you just take, and even if you take advanced, like even if you come up with analytics, they're still very much going to tell you that one player has better numbers than the other players. So if you look at something like the ECAC and you're like, well, Jimmy Vesey's not scoring a lot, or even I'm going to use Princeton as an example because their season just ended, so that means my little ones, Ryan Kuffner, Max Verona, and Josh Tevez are all free agents. They've gotten a little bit better of attention, but they typically don't get a lot of attention because their numbers are not always going to be as high as everyone else's, even if you take into account that they're playing less games, just because they play in a league that's just structured so differently than anybody else. Because even if you're not, the ECAC is like, when the ECAC was really good, it was basically all built around, like St. Lawrence was one of the top teams in the country because they had a defense that would just like snuff the life out of you, and they had really good goaltending. Princeton also was very defensive. So if you look at stuff like that, so that's like going back to the data without context. So for us, a lot of what we do, like, if you watch, you'll know. So the best thing, like I know Hannah pointed out something like watching and then doing research to either support or disprove what you saw. Before we had Corsi available, that's the same thing I did. So that was one of the years that the Big Ten was like super run and gun offense, and Penn State had probably one of the best offenses in the country, which if you look at the numbers, you can say, oh wow, they score a lot. If you crunch the numbers a little bit more, you can say, okay, they're not shooting, their shooting percentage isn't that great. It's a little bit better now than it used to be. But to that point, like now you add in another thing, like, well, why is their shooting percentage so bad? Like, is their offense actually really good or is it really not good, which is debatable. And that kind of comes into play with, it's a little bit more complicated than even just deciding where they've taken shots from. And a lot of it, like a lot of analytics stuff people do, like they actually watch first. Like a lot of people watch first and then you track it by hand, which is what I used to do too. So it's just like, I don't know what the point of this is.
You're 4 minutes.
I have 4 minutes left?
No.
Okay, I'm done unless anyone has pressing questions.
All right, John? Tell me more.
Hello. Hey everyone, so my name is John. I'm a data science and analytics consultant for the Boeing company, and I dabble in hockey analytics on the side. It's my first time attending, it's been great again. So I'm also Australian, so please don't hold that against me. But yay, Nathan Walker. This talk today focuses on a personal project I've been working on related to hacking player tracking. So the common refrain I've been hearing all weekend is that once we have player and puck tracking technology, we can do all the things. So I actually wondered about how difficult that might actually be. This is my attempt to hack together a really basic system that will do the puck and player tracking using nothing more than open source technologies and tools and and publicly available video streams. So the first thing I had to do was to grab some input data. So images were sourced from YouTube highlights packages, really simple stuff, sampled at 1 frame per second, and filtered the useful stuff at the top there from the garbage that we can't really use. So the bottom stuff we filtered out, resulting in about 6,500 images for hand annotation, which seems like a pretty onerous task. This is part of the manual annotation process. I annotated about 250 images with various different classes, so things like home and away skater, home and away goalie, puck, the referee, and a bunch of other reference objects that I thought I might need for the to triangulate position. I have a joke about Eric Carlson there, but I don't have time. I assure you it was very funny. Yeah, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this model. I did train 2 models for this. The first one was this guy, which was to distinguish between those 2 sets of images, so the useful stuff at the start and the garbage that we want to throw out. It uses Keras and TensorFlow and Python, and it got reasonably good accuracy, but it's way less exciting than the other bit, and given time, I will skip ahead. So this is the key to the whole thing. I leverage the Google Object Detection API for the image classifier and detector to detect the skaters, goalies, and the pucks. Use that architecture, and again, don't have enough time to get into much detail about any of this, but it's neural network architecture, which is good for image analysis and processing, and gives us a reasonable trade-off between speed and accuracy, or so I'm told. I trained it using the Google Cloud service, I guess you call it, which leverages GPU support so that you can train things way faster than using CPU. And I use what we call transfer learning to warm start the training algorithm. So for neural networks, basically all that you end up with is a huge set of weights at the end of the process. A cold start means you initialize the algorithm with randomized weights, which take far longer to converge. And the transfer learning is basically taking a set of weights that has been generated by another model for a not dissimilar problem and using them as the starting weights for our problem. So in this case, we used the weights that were generated from Google's implementation of this particular architecture, the MobileNet architecture, trained on the COCO dataset, which is a huge dataset of many, many object classes of interest, including people, among hundreds of other things. So we were able to get this thing trained in about 2.5 hours instead of the order of weeks. And this is the cool stuff, so hopefully this works. So I've got a few things, sorry, I just need to catch up here on the other side. Catch up to my notes, which I don't, there we go. So while I play this, I'm going to talk through a few things. So you can see, so from bad camera angles, we didn't have any data, but so it's pretty bad there. You can see it's mistaking the goalie for a skater a lot of the time. That's because we have way more observations of skaters than we have of goalies. You can see it's very patchy, and that's because I haven't incorporated, basically the algorithm treats each frame as a separate entity and doesn't take any information from previous frames, and then stitches everything together. So what you've got is actually, we're not incorporating the fact that that player was like, you know, yeah, I think you get the idea. There's no fluidity there. With some post-processing rules, we could probably improve that. What's the other thing? Yeah, so the other thing too is that we are not calibrating the per class probabilities very well. Basically, anything the algorithm says is greater than 50-50, we're saying that's an object. So for each of the different objects that we're considering, we probably want to calibrate those probabilities a little bit better. I think that's, so the most surprising thing about all of this is how, relatively speaking, how good the results were from a 200 image data set, right? So typically these algorithms take millions of data points to perform with any degree of accuracy, but thanks to the transfer learning process, we're able to detect the objects, but we probably need to tweak it a little bit in terms of assigning classes and things like that. I think that's all I have, but I think I've talked through most of those, and that's kind of where we're aiming for. Without knowing more about the camera setup of the at the individual arenas, it's probably going to be hard to do this translation, but this is kind of where we're headed. And I do have a much longer presentation on this topic for anyone who's interested, but this has been condensed. Yes?
There was a presentation at Ottawa conference by Campbell Weaver.
Yeah.
That did something that looks exactly like yours.
Really?
And seemed to have the same problems as you.
Oh, okay. That is simultaneously comforting and depressing.
You should visit the page of the Ottawa Analytics last year and see his presentation.
Okay.
Because it seems like we did the same thing.
Yeah, wow. That's, yeah. Cool.
Can I buy you a beer later? Can we talk about this?
I have to shoot back to Vancouver, but connect with me on Twitter for sure.
Awesome.
Yeah.
What were the cloud costs to run this, like per game or per minute of video?
So I was dealing with, I downloaded 30 clips, I think, each about 5 minutes, but again, I was only using 250 images. The training costs were around $10, but if you sign up, you get a free, I think it's $300 US for a year that you can use, so it was well under whatever, but I think that's probably my time.
If other people have questions, that's fine.
Where can we get the full presentation?
I will make it available afterwards with the email and everything else.
Did you try this with different resolutions, and are the results similar at lower resolutions?
Yes and yes. I was very surprised by that. So due to the nature of the clips that I downloaded, everything came at different resolutions, and that's how I got that Carlson mullet photo. There was some I found actually the Islanders were horrible in terms of their resolution, not in terms of their yeah, so that it was surprisingly robust to differences in resolution. Yeah.
It's not giving us individual players, right?
No. That's a much tougher solve, which I think the SportLogic guys have a very much more sophisticated way of doing this. Cool. Thanks, everyone.
And our last lightning talk is Nathan. Nathan. Last call for Nathan. Oh, there it is. Yay.
While we're getting it set up, I do want to thank all the organizers of the event, and also thank everybody in attendance. I've had a great time this weekend, learned a lot, talking to a lot of people, and meeting an awful lot of interesting folks as well.
Use this file.
It's very creative.
We've all been there.
So this had its genesis back in 1997 originally. I believe it was an ECHL game that was following, and saw on the paper the next day that the team had scored 5 power play goals in 8 opportunities, and they were credited with 62.5% on the game. The opponent was charged with a 37.5% penalty kill. The team that scored the 5 also allowed 3 shorthanded goals. I thought, oh, that's kind of stupid. It doesn't really tell the whole story. So is there actually a better way of doing it? Is there something that's a bit more descriptive? So being the 14-year-old that I was, I said, what if we just subtract these out? So I had to collate statistics by hand. Now, I want to emphasize that I'm not claiming to invent this at all, which is just simply removing things. I pulled it all up a couple years ago, recompiled everything. This is the last 25 seasons of various special teams metrics, broken down by team, year, etc. And I want to see if there's any correlation to actual success on the ice. So good one.
Wrong way.
Okay. Come on. All right, so it won't let me sort it. Or I'm just too far below it. No, that's a definite no.
Oh, yep. You need to save a copy.
So what I had to decide, I want to break down the entire difference between penalty killing, power play, and then how it compared to simple special teams metrics. It wasn't necessarily that interesting. I didn't find any particularly strong correlations between an overall improved power play, between an overall great penalty kill, and actual playoff success, which was kind of unusual. Then I filtered it through and ran it under even strength. So what I'm going to do real quick, the teams that are highlighted in green here are the playoff teams. The ones that are in white are non-playoff teams. So this is sorting by the overall power play metric, and you can see right here we have the 16-17 Sabres. We have a pretty solid power play and did not make the playoffs at all. We can also sort by the overall penalty kill here. And we can see, this is kind of interesting. Out of the top 4 teams here, 3 of them played for the Stanley Cup. They actually played in the Cup finals, all of them lost. Then right here we have Montreal, who didn't make the playoffs at all. We go by overall power or overall special teams. Nah, nothing too meaningful. Then I sorted by even strength, plus minus. The real question, I think, is why exactly are we focusing so much on the minutiae of the game in all these different aspects? And I think this is ultimately why. Let me know when you see a non-playoff team. This is out of 720 team seasons here. This one?
There it is.
There it is. That is the one. Number 133 is the first team that missed the playoffs. And I can just keep going here, because it's going to take a little while to find another one. There we go. Out of the top 200 teams, or excuse me, out of the top 240 teams, sorted by even strength plus minus on a per game basis, 235 of them made playoffs. And once in the playoffs, now 25 seasons, there have been 25 Stanley Cup winners. There have been 25 Stanley Cup runners up. Out of the top 240, which is that top third, 24 Stanley Cup winners have come out of this group. The only that did not is the 2011-12 LA Kings. And I would venture to guess that if you start looking at things like trade deadline acquisitions, they'd probably be right up in a very high echelon. But there's not a great way to do that. Trade deadlines have shifted all over the place. That ultimately is the determining factor. Now we can go all the way down towards the bottom, and as we get lower and lower and lower, everything just kind of sort of, it starts disintegrating pretty quickly. We start looking at going 30, 40, 50 teams before we find other playoff teams. And it follows almost completely linear. Out of the bottom 80 teams, not a single one made the playoffs. Out of the next 80 above that, 6 of them made it. It's actually broken down further on this handy little chart right here. Not much for us, just in case you haven't tell. I usually compile the data, I read it on my own, and then kind of tell a story. I've kind of forgotten how to do the graphing, to be perfectly honest. But you can see this is broken down by clusters of 80 teams. So on the power play metric right here, that's the percentage of teams that made the playoffs out of each particular group. How many Stanley Cups they won, how many Cup finalists there were. You can see they sort of spread all over the place, and then this is for overall special teams. And then right here, when we get into the even strength plus and minus, this is what happens. But the real question is, what exactly, where is the break point? What I discovered is that the difference between having a 95% probability of actually making the playoffs and just simply missing the playoffs completely falls right about here. That number right there that's highlighted, above that number, if you have a 95% chance of making the Stanley Cup playoffs, of getting a hot run from a goalie, going all the way through and winning the Stanley Cup. Below that, the number's still off your map. That number is one even strength goal per 11.7 games. That is the difference between making the playoffs. That is what ultimately all this is focused on. All this minutia, all the focus on these little events of things. When we say that hockey is a game of inches or football is a game of inches, that one even strength goal per 12 games essentially is ultimately the difference between having a great chance to capture glory and just kind of floundering around the midpoint and not doing much of anything. Thank you.
That's our last lightning talk for the day and our last talk of the weekend. I want to thank everyone who came out this year. I want to specifically thank all the GMs who helped us set up the expansion draft activity. I know John was working really hard last minute to get those visuals up. I want to thank everyone who came from a really long distance and moved their schedule around to be able to speak this weekend. I know some of you pushed some stuff around. And I just want to thank everyone for showing up at all the socials so far. It's been amazing, and we hope to see you tonight at the Angry Beaver. And final thanks to Josh Weisbach and Garrett Holt, who's not here today, who helped us with the transfer this year, and we're hoping are willing to take the event back, but it's probably been a really busy, less than busy year for them, so we'll see.
Thanks so much.
Feel free to reach out. We're going to have the speakers and the presentations up within the next couple of days. If you guys have any further questions, feel free to reach out to us.
Yeah, but